So we're going to get started with our last panel of the day. Virtual cowbell. Okay. Thank you for sticking with us for this long but very important discussion. This is the last panel of our day, entitled Who Decides? Private Development, Community Land Trusts, and Climate Resilient Landscapes. This panel, we hope, will address the question that was sort of touched upon in the previous panel. The question of if the BQE with freight moved to rail and water were to become a narrower tree-lined boulevard rather than a trenched or elevated highway, what would communities want to do with this newly available land bank? For example, for every 7 blocks along the BQE, 1 full city block could be reclaimed, which means about 80 to 90 blocks across its whole 30-mile length. So for comparison, Central Park is 150 blocks, so that's more than half the size of Central Park. Something to consider. So similar to the previous panels, I'll just introduce the moderator and the speakers, and then they'll speak one by one. Our moderator, Elizabeth Goldstein, is president of the Municipal Art Society of New York. Her background is in parks, historic preservation, and management. Throughout her career, she's worked to ensure transparent public engagement and civic decisions of consequence to public spaces and the heritage of key places across the United States. She was also a member of Mayor de Blasio's expert panel on the BQE. Our first speaker will be David McCarty. He's a real estate professional, vice president at ASLA. Thad Pawlowski will be our second speaker. He's managing director of the Center for Resilient Cities and Landscapes at Columbia. Monxo Lopez will be our third speaker. He's associate curator at the Museum of the City of New York, and he's also an environmental and urban justice advocate. And our last speaker will be Andy Sell. He's a landscape architect, a senior associate, and an ecologist at Sasaki. So we will get started with David.
Hi everyone, I'm David McCarty. I'm with Alloy Development. Alloy is a boutique real estate design and development firm. We're based in Dumbo. We are all architects and developers. Most of our work is in Brooklyn. The last 4 or 5 projects have been in Dumbo. I am not a BQE expert, but I thought I do have a lot of experience working in public-private partnerships. And so when I spoke to Janet and she invited me to participate today, I thought it would be helpful to just review quickly 2 public-private partnerships that I've had the pleasure of working on, and maybe some lessons learned as it relates to what to do with newly created land or discovered land through a BQE reclamation. So the first is Brooklyn Bridge Park, which I'm sure you are all very familiar with. I worked as the director of real estate at Brooklyn Bridge Park during its development. I won't spend a ton of time on the history of the park because I think everybody is very familiar. This is a photo from the 1940s when the BQE triple cantilever was first being built in the Brooklyn Heights section. This is what the park looked like before we started demolition and construction of the first phases. And what's interesting about Brooklyn Bridge Park as a public-private partnership is there was a very clear mandate in 2002 when the then governor and mayor signed the first MOU to create the park, and that was that they would fund the capital cost to build it, on the one very important caveat that it be financially self-sustaining after the construction was complete. And that was a goal that really shaped the development of the park. This is obviously the dramatic transformation that's taken place since that point in time. About 8% of the park land was set aside for private development, took the form of a hotel, residential, office, retail, cultural, theater, concessions, a marina. And the revenue that's been generated off of those sites in the form of ground rent payments and payment in lieu of tax has been enough to date, and hopefully will be for the perpetuity of the life, to manage the ongoing operational expenses. This is a really interesting model when you think about BQE reclamation, because it has truly been, in my opinion, a dramatic transformation and a huge success story for Brooklyn. Last year, I think there were 5 million visitors to Brooklyn Bridge Park, and it's been around 13 years since the first phase opened, and it's already seen and viewed as one of the most important public assets that we have in Brooklyn. This kind of specific goal setting, right? The goal was we want to create a signature waterfront park, but it needs to be financially self-sufficient. That was very clear from the outset, and it has led the master plan, the general project plan, and the actual execution. So that's one version of a public-private partnership. In this case, the land was 100% publicly owned. Another sort of different flavor of a public-private partnership is what I've been working on for the last 8 years. The Alloy block downtown, which was previously known as 80 Flatbush, is a full city block in downtown Brooklyn. It's bounded by Flatbush right across from Atlantic Terminal. This is before the first phase of construction started. This was a different public-private partnership in that about 75% of the land was privately owned, and about 25% of the land was owned by the New York City Department of Education. And so Alloy Development, the company I work for, partnered with the New York City Educational Construction Fund and underwent a large rezoning to increase the density across the block in exchange for the provision of a series of very valuable public assets, $230 million of public assets in the form of new public schools, 200 units of permanently affordable housing, a new cultural facility, et cetera, were all unlocked essentially through somewhat free legislative or administrative change in the zoning maps. And so I think as it relates to the BQE, and we heard in previous panels, the sort of underutilization of many sections of the panel, of the BQE, we should think about the current zoning in those areas. Is it the right zoning, and what kind of change in zoning could unlock? So this was the results of that rezoning. It's 900 units of housing, 200 of which is permanently affordable housing, 2 public schools, office space, retail, a new cultural facility. And again, it is a very unique way that a municipality can, through a no-cost legislative change, i.e. changing the zoning, unlock a tremendous amount of economic value that can be steered in a variety of different directions. It could go towards housing, educational uses, public space, clinics, et cetera. So as we think about the space specifically that could be reclaimed, I think this is another version to think about not only the immediate land that gets reclaimed, but the area around it and what potential changes of zoning could result in some of these additional public benefits. I'll leave it with that. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. I'm Thad Pawlowski. I'm going to forego my slides because so much information today, and I'm still absorbing. I'm not a transportation planner. I'm an urban designer. I work on climate change. So I work on climate change adaptation, and I know that the way that we plan and design infrastructure in this country is massively fucked. It has been for a very long time. And we have no idea how to fix it, honestly. Like, we can't do big projects anymore. The recent East River Park that Michael Kimmelman wrote so perfectly about, that infrastructure project, which was intended to help people, like intended to make people safe, actually created all kinds of new divisions in the neighborhood. Like, we are creating more division, more harm. It's like Robert Moses all over again. So I don't know if I trust us to build the infrastructure of this next generation. It's really concerning. But I don't want to just sort of come up here and complain. I want to hear from you all, if you don't mind, just a quick poll. So I'm going to throw out some options for who decides. That's the format of this panel. Who decides? So who thinks that that the future of the BQE should be decided through a ULURP process, where maybe Alloy or some private developer proposes a value capture mechanism and distributes, we use a public-private partnership to pay for that. Anybody? Any applause there? Sorry, David, that's probably not going to fly. Who thinks that a panel of activists, like we heard right before lunch, like, environmental justice leaders, the neighborhoods, the people who were most affected by the, urban renewal of the 1950s, should those neighborhoods, the activists that represent them, decide? Can I hear? All right, I see like 10 hands, 12, yeah, okay, all right. This is the one that I think that's gonna be most popular. Who thinks like a panel of experts should get together and all just like dream up the best stuff, like the people that were just on stage? Should they decide? Okay, let's give our experts a round of applause because they're really awesome. All right, but maybe it's all those things, and I would hope so, but I just, one other option. And I know it's going to sound a little hokey, but I think what's given me hope, because I don't trust my own, like I've been planning big projects myself for 20 years in New York City. Last night I walked through Hudson Yards, and I as a planner at New York City Planning, I worked on that, but I think it's awful, like all of you probably, like it's so stupid, all these glassy buildings. But I walked through the public space there, and there was like this incredible dance party. And I was like, I don't know shit. Like I thought Hudson Yards was gonna be antiseptic, everything bad, and like you never know when there's gonna be a dance party. Like you never know when something that you thought was really bad is gonna turn out good, or something you thought was really good is gonna turn out bad. I'm not defending Hudson Yards. I still think it's really ugly and awful, but at the same time, like those people were having fun, so we don't know everything. So I think that our generation has failed. So I think that we should put the decision-making power in the hands of younger people. And during the pandemic, because they're the ones that have to live with these infrastructure decisions. And we need to, working in the climate crisis space, young people are dealing with so much grief and anxiety about the future of our country, about the future of the world, about their own futures. And what really makes them that starts to address both the mental health crisis and the crisis in our infrastructure is empowerment of these young people to actually take control, make reparations for the harm that has been caused by past generations of experts, and at the same time, like come up with the ideas and the vision that could actually get us beyond the packaged solutions that we all think are, in our expert minds, the right thing. So during the pandemic, I started working with these high school students in Washington Heights, which is a neighborhood disproportionately affected by the Cross-Manhattan Expressway. And there's a whole group of schools on 182nd Street, and some of the students in these schools have organized to create a clean air green corridor. They're gonna turn the street in front of their school into a park, and this is their own initiative. They've been working with their local businesses, community board, council members, and doing their own advocacy and finding support along the way. And I don't think necessarily all the school students along the BQE, but maybe could get together and come up with their own plan for what it could be. Certainly they would need to be empowered with the expertise in this room. But it's just in the spirit of humility, just knowing that my own planning ideas have largely failed, I think we need to hand it over to the next generation. So, thanks.
Hola. Hola. Mi nombre es Monxo. I'm Monxo Lopez. Okay, here. How does this work? There, yes. So, I first want to say that a day like today was born Toussaint Louverture, the father of the Haitian Revolution, and he led an army of formerly enslaved people, and he kicked the butt of the French Empire, of the English Empire, and of the Spanish Empire. And if he was able to do that, we should be able to take care of the BQE, okay? So, I want to thank my fantastic co-presenters and Elizabeth that is gonna be moderating the questions later, and thanks to my big brother, Jonathan, and Janet Fink, and the whole IPA gang. I wanted to start by letting you know that me and a group of comrades are working with the generous funding of the Mellon Foundation on a new initiative that is going to be a learning exchange for peers. We're going to select 9 peers, and we're going to run a curriculum for 15 months. And the IPA is going to be a leading partner in the initiative. It is tailor-made for activists with an active practice on the ground, place-based activism. And it's only going to be 9 people. And the initiative is called the Shape of Cities to Come Institute. And so more soon about that. I was asked to speak about community land trusts. I am sure that many of you are familiar with what they are. I want to say something about me that will explain some of what will follow. I am trained as a political theorist. I studied with a guy called Marshall Berman, who was a great political philosopher and a great thinker of New York. And so I did my doctorate with him on the political philosophy of Albert Camus, and some of that moralism and haranguing is going to show up here, okay? So community land trusts, they are a mechanism that separates the land and the buildings that are on top of the land, and the communities that live on that land take control of the land in perpetuity, okay? And so usually the way that happens is that either we lobby the city to transfer the title of land to the community, to a bunch of activists that have organized, or we pool the resources, I don't know, we threaten or rob a bank or whatever, and we buy land, and then we put it in the community trust in perpetuity. Traditionally, community land trusts have been used for affordable housing, but they can be used for a lot of things. In Mott Haven, in the South Bronx where I live, we're using it to establish a cultural center, okay? And there are folks in Western Queens that are doing a startup space for local business people and for training. There are people that are doing some queer comrades are working on a beach in the Rockaways to take control over their space in safety. Community land trusts are called CLT, community land trusts. The community basically, and this is where it starts getting relevant for this, is you have a geographic catchment area, okay? And people that live in that community take control and control the stuff that happens there. The land, basically, it's about transferring the property of that land and the ownership to the community now so that they can control it, but also steward it towards the future. And the trust is basically that stewarding that happened. I sit on 2 boards here in community land trusts in New York City. The movement started in the 1960s with black farmers of the civil rights movement. This is the network of CLTs, community land trusts, that exists right now in the city. I sit on the board of 2 of those, the oldest one, which is the Cooper Square Community Land Trust, and one of the youngest one, the one in Mott Haven. This is the project that we're working on in Mott Haven. That's the cultural center that I was talking about previously. I wanted to say that the Cooper Square one, we own 23 buildings with over 350 units that are affordable in perpetuity. I want to say, before I'm done, 5 things about the BQE. It is a wound. It is a wound on the land, it is a wound in our communities, and I am baffled to see how we love those wounds so much that we are not thinking about how to burn the thing to the ground, but about how to live with them. And if I am a sadomasochist and I like to preserve my wounds, I have no right to pass those wounds to the generations that are still not born. And so I think that we need to think really, really hard about it, because I hear a lot about how we can live with it. We don't have to. Number two, I hate it with all my heart. I used to live in Brooklyn. I remember hours of sitting in traffic, and I remember being trapped in places where I couldn't escape the fumes and the noise. I will say also that when it comes to who decides, as Thad was asking us, I think that I haven't heard about the original owners of this land, the indigenous communities that live here. Jonathan knows them because they live and they have the house next to the block house, the American Indian Community House. I think that they should be co-leading this. Like all of our expertise, et cetera, but we need to ask them what they would like to see in their land. I will say also that Jonathan and I have talked a lot about how destruction or the reimagining of the BQE is a vast opportunity for prestige and money-making, and because everyone has to pay the rent and everyone wants Michael Kimmelman to write about them in the New York Times, this is a highly visible stage, and it will get the worst out of many people, okay? Activists will become predators of each other, just as architects and urban planners are already. And I will ask you not to play that game, not collaborate in that sense, and that rather than thinking about new plans and new architecture, et cetera, we should think about the architecture of opening space, political space, so that the people, the legitimate owners of that land and of those territories and the communities that have been there for a long time are the ones who decide. I am a CLT advocate, and I think that they're very, very important, but as you know, this wound spans a few communities, and what's going to happen, because I know about this, is that because these communities all will want to see their plans enacted, you're going to see a lot of competition, indecision, stalling, and sabotaging. And it's very, very likely the architects and planners, developers and politicians will span the flames of discord so they can get their way and get their money, okay? This is where I get back to indigenous folks. They are human beings, and they are prone to do exactly the same shit we do. However, for thousands of years, they didn't recognize the limits and the divisions that we have created on that land. And I think that that's an aspiration for all of us to come and to make of one mind to decide what's going to happen with that land. And finally, just that to remember, I have a friend who says there are no solutions, there are only rearrangement of problems. So don't think that you're going to solve this, you're going to create new problems, and such is life.
Hi, everyone. So you're probably thinking, an ecologist in the room. I love being the curveball. So I don't study transportation planning, but I've learned so much today. As an ecologist, I study ecological systems, the movement of energy, the movement of carbon from aquatic to terrestrial systems all the way up into the atmosphere. So it's systems thinking, and I think that has a lot to do with what we've been talking about all day today. And I first want to take this moment to thank all of you for being here, because it takes many voices, and all of this ingenuity really comes from you and your energy to solve problems like this. So I'm going to throw another curveball at you, and we're going to travel 3,000 miles. Has anyone seen this landscape before? Has anyone gone on vacation? You might have seen this. This is actually Athens, Greece. And what you're looking at here in yellow is the Acropolis. In blue, on the right-hand side, on the other side of the Hymettus Mountains, is the new Athens International Airport. And what you're seeing here on the bottom is the old Ellinikon International Airport for Athens, which was decommissioned in 2001. And so when the new airport was started in 2001, they had big plans, they had big aspirations. It's 650 acres of open space that is densely populated. It has about 3 kilometers of coastal landscape that has not been developed, primarily not been developed. And so they had big plans on what they wanted to do with this. When the airport was decommissioned, they first saw it as an opportunity to host the 2004 Olympics. And so part of the landscape was converted into Olympic facilities. And then the Greek austerity happened, the economic collapse. So since 2001 or 2004, the site has sat vacant. Nothing has happened. The Greek government, Athens central government, they had no plan of action to move this project forward. There have been so many design competitions. So many people have touched this project to think about how do we renaturalize or re-energize this area of infrastructure that has been so vacant. So 650 acres, it's about 3/4 the size of Central Park. If you're thinking about all of the green spaces in New York, so many different sizes, shapes, connectivity. In Athens, their parks are archaeological sites. There's no grassy fields to play sports. It's very hot there. And during COVID, there was a huge dynamic change between how Athenians related to the landscape, because they all of a sudden had nowhere to go. They were stuck in their houses. They couldn't go to some of these sites, the recreational sites that are mostly archaeological. And so the Ellinikon airport region really serves, or could serve, as that huge green space, that central park for the entire city. It's a huge opportunity. So David spoke about the opportunity of having kind of a private-public partnership, and that's where this project has kind of like taken off in the last 5-6 years. I've been working on this for 3 years. So many people have worked on this, and it's a basket of problems. I'm not going to like solve this, and I'm trying to do it justice in just 5 minutes, but telling you about how this project works, if we're thinking about who decides on the BQE, we should be thinking about, no matter who, if it's private, if it's public, we should be thinking about ecological systems, and we should be thinking about designing for not the problems of today, but the problems of tomorrow. So that was one of the big issues, or big design pushes for the Ellinikon, was thinking about climate change, specifically because the space itself it's a big tarmac. It's all concrete. And we've heard a lot about how the highway influences air pollution. Do you know what else influences air pollution? Heat, urban heat. Highways are a number one source of urban heat, especially in New York City, where we have so much impervious surface. The Ellinikon Airport, if you're in that area, if you're, let's say, I forgot the actual distance, but just outside the perimeter, ambient air temperatures are at least 10 degrees Fahrenheit more than anywhere else in the city. And if you're actually in the airport area, they can be upwards of 20, 25 degrees. It's a huge heat sink. And so a big area for this was thinking about how are we designing for the changing climate, more heat, and we're doing that through material use. We're also, we talked about, or I heard in one talk earlier about embodied carbon. you're probably seeing carbon on all of these slides. Huge push for thinking about how can we really make this park carbon neutral. Mega infrastructure projects like the BQE, like the Big Dig in Boston, and like Elenicon are not sustainable. They're designed to be sustainable eventually, or to deal with climate change, but that construction causes a huge amount of, has a huge amount of carbon cost. That's from demolition, that's from construction, and we're trying to resolve that in design through reuse. So I talked about designing for ecological systems. A big part of this, and if we're thinking about the BQE, is all these little kind of like nodes of maybe potential open space. We could be thinking about those as one interconnected system as a habitat, especially for an urban species. In Athens, for example, there's many different species that move from the coast into the highlands, and so that's what we've tried to design for. The other part of that is thinking about food systems, and how do we think about providing different habitats, different types of landscapes, not just for the animals that use them, but also for people. The BQE, because it's such a big project, like the Elenicon, we're using it as an opportunity to inspire change in other areas. So that's a big part of thinking about how can we mobilize other areas that touch this project. The nursery trade in Greece couldn't necessarily handle 3 million new plants. There's just not enough grown in country, and that's the other part of it. So we wanted to make sure everything that was coming into this project was produced locally. It's funded locally. Everything that's coming, it should provide local jobs. All of the materials should be local. Another part of that is thinking about how does it inspire intergenerational stewardship. Like I said, the reason why I am right now is because I grew up on a farm, and most Athenians don't have that connection to the environment. And so we're trying to create a green space that provides that opportunity, that nearby nature, to inspire the next generation of environmental stewards. And so it's really meant to be this lasting landscape, not just for now, but for the next 100 years. And the exciting thing is it's actually under construction now. We had, during the design phase, we had a contingent of Greek officials and the design team and the development team actually come to New York to look at world-class parks. So they're looking at you as a way to do this. Yes, they went to Central Park, of course. They went to Hunters Point. They went to Brooklyn Bridge Park. So they're looking to you as an opportunity to learn from you in those systems. And I'll just have to say that they're hitting the ground running. It's already under construction. We've done a huge amount of work primarily to save trees on site, but also transplant them. A lot of these are olive trees, so you can kind of hack them up and they kind of sprout right back really quickly after you replant them. And another big part is they've already opened one little piece of the park, the Experience Park, which is really meant to be kind of a showcase to the community on what this project is, but also to gather community feedback on, in the next 6 years as the park rolls out, what are those little changes that we can do to make it even better? So when we think about who decides, it's everybody. And we also have to think about how do we also fund it too. So thank you.
Well, hello everybody. I know we're all absorbing a ton of information all day, and you've been listening to people talk for a really long time. So we're going to try to be super lively and move to your questions as quick as possible, right? Well, thank you again to IPA for drawing us all together to talk about this extremely important infrastructure project. And thank you to all these great panelists. So thank you again for all your comments. I hope you'll help me thank them. As Janet indicated when she introduced this panel, the length of the BQE is long, and the potential acreage of it is, well, the existing acreage of it is very large. This potential transformation of the BQE from the Queen, and I'm going to insist that we really think about it, including the Q, the Queens part, the Brooklyn-Queens Expressway, is a very large piece of land, potentially, which could be used in many, many different ways. And I think for the purpose of this panel, we're going to assume that we're really using it in different kinds of ways, right? That it's not the transportation corridor in the current sense of the word. We're thinking big. So put on your big idea hats for the moment, and we're going to talk about who would decide how those other uses would happen and how that should happen. And I want to start by just asking a question about if you hypothetically had 30 miles of a former road that was miraculously gone, how would you begin to decide how to use it? And what I mean by that is, would you think, to Andy's point about it as a continuous corridor in some manner, shape, or form, whether that's for environmental purposes or others, or would you think about it in a community by community way? So I'm just going to throw that out to my panelists and dive right in.
I can jump in. I think that it makes sense as a community by community way to envision the land use. It was somewhat an arbitrary cut through an organic existing urban fabric, and so that cut need not stay. And the difference land use needs in Sunset Park are different than downtown Brooklyn, or different than Williamsburg. I think you have to really start by actually getting back to the organic urban fabric and remove yourself from this sort of slash through the city.
I would be thinking about ecosystem services, all the utilities that go unseen that we typically need. Public trees, they are a public utility. They provide so many ecosystem benefits. And so beyond all of the other tangible items or facilities that we need to support our communities, we also need to be thinking about our community health.
I'm an academic, so I'll just be academic about this and say that I don't agree with the premise of the question. It sort of presupposes that there's a benevolent dictator in each of us that would make a decision for other people. And I think that's not the way the world works, nor should it work that way. Like, I feel like we should be asking, like, what rights do people have to the land? Not who decides, because, the democratic process in land use decision making is also like just a figment of the powerful's imagination. It really isn't that. It's just power operating. And we don't have a real democracy when it comes to, because we live in a society where ownership is 9/10 of the law, and so who decides is like who has the power. And I think the only curb to that is what rights do we have? What alliances are we able to build? What ways do we have to counter that power?
I will follow up on that with my experience, that I have learned the hard way not to imagine publicly or play games and exercises about imagining what should happen with the land of other people and other communities, because I always end up paying up the price. I will resent greatly if people were just planning and envisioning and imagining and about the highways that are equally wounds in my community, in the community where I live. And so I think that it's, I think that it would be fantastic if we could step away from literal design and urban thinking and planning, as we are used to do it in this country, and use all of that experience in design and imagination, et cetera, and planning to really, again, open up the political process that it's necessary to have legitimacy and real ownership and real care for whatever happens in the future. And I think that most of the people that I've heard talk here, they do have those skills in planning, in designing, in envisioning, but maybe we should use those skills in a slightly different way.
So I want to just follow up on that because I think this is very consistent with a very important question here. So this land is owned to the extent that it's ever owned by anyone by the state of New York, right? Because it is a New York State highway corridor. And I guess, so I want to follow up on just points that many of you made here about who should own this land if it is in the process of being re-envisioned. Do we imagine that, and forgive me for that word, do we intend that it would continue to be state land? Do we think it should be New York City land? Or do we think it should be the land of the communities who surround it, who might plan for it, and in fact, within some processes, determine its future uses? Because that's, in essence, what has been the problem here, right? We're both seeing the constraints of the highway itself and living within the constraints of what we envision as possible, but we also live within this expectation about land ownership. So I want to just throw that out as, yes, it is indeed a little bit of a hypothetical here, but it is something one can envision. For instance, as you talked about land trusts earlier, Monxo, that for $1, the land might go to the adjacent communities, for instance. So I'm asking you to think a little bit about that and what might be best for, in your view, what might be best in terms of an approach to that land ownership question, because it does determine who decides.
Well, one thing that we hear from like planners all over the world is like, don't let it go. You know, like if you have public land, like don't sell it. Like everybody regrets selling public land. Yeah, right? Yeah. Ground leases maybe, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. I think that we've gotten to a place in the city where we have mostly stopped disposing of the fee title of land, and I think that's a smart urban strategy and plan. One tension that I think exists, and maybe to take your question slightly in a different way, from everything we've heard today, to actually get to a place where we're reclaiming this much land would have real significant citywide impacts. It would come potentially with real citywide costs or real citywide impacts. And so I am of the belief that there needs to be a combination of city and community priorities and goal setting. There are certain neighborhoods that the BQE goes through that are very affluent and largely predominantly white neighborhoods who have a history of anti-development. And so I don't know that the city necessarily should incur all of this cost and all of these impacts and not have a say in how that land gets developed. We are living through an unprecedented housing crisis. There's some 70, 80,000 people sleeping in homeless shelters tonight. There's 50% of people that live in the city are rent burdened. They can't afford to live here. So converting land in Carroll Gardens or Cobble Hill as an example into a park exclusively might not be the best citywide policy at the moment. And there needs to be a combination of the two.
Right, and I think what you're getting at, David, is this whole question about how do we combine both the community's desires and needs, very real needs, with citywide needs, and that is a question not only of land use, but also of how do we respond to climate change, how do we deal with the affordability crisis, and so on. And I guess part of my question to all of you is about that balance, and I think you've answered that a little bit, David, but I'm interested in your the other panelists' views on the similar question.
I think that all of the solutions that you sketch out about state ownership, city ownership, even a community land trust, all of them will be new problems. They are, to an extent, you need to consider those, or I'll consider those within the ratio of utilitarianism and morality. There are ones that are going to be easier to do, like let's give it to New York State, or let's give it to New York City, or remain in New York City's hand, that will be highly illegitimate to me, for example. Whereas on the other side, like what I deem like the legitimate solutions, which will be giving the decision to the different communities, affluent or not, along the way, will be a highly problematic thing on the ground. Yeah. But Eisenhower once said that whenever you had a problem that you couldn't solve, you make it larger. And so this is a big problem. I think that I like the concept of balance in the abstract. I come from a community that whenever balance is mentioned, is to screw us up. Even Comrade Ocasio-Cortez, with the Green New Deal, there were, on the, small letters there of the deal, they were, planning to cut corners through Mud Haven. Meaning that the Green New Deal and the saving of our city, et cetera, was going to be shouldered by us again. And so whenever I hear balance, I'm like, maybe sometimes balance it's overstated or overhyped. So I just think that it should be given to the people that are there, the different communities. It's going to be a mess. It's going to be a mess one way or another. I think that we should step away from thinking that it's going to be the end of the world. Like, what are we going to do with the trucks, with the stores? I think that we're going to have problems. I think that we're going to lose a lot of jobs. I think that given the capitalist system, there will be jobs that also will be created and opportunities, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, I think that we should do the right thing rather than the most expeditious thing, which will be like this Moses-like solution, which isn't going to be a solution.
I assume you're talking about biblical Moses and not
Both.
Moses. Both.
Both of them.
Thad, did you have something to add?
No, I was hoping for the ecological perspective on that.
Yeah. From the ecological perspective, I don't think that it necessarily matters who owns the land, because in the end, the earth will shed us, get rid of us. I'm sorry. You talk to a geologist, you talk to an ecologist, we all have different views on how the world will end and adapt without us. But I think being from Metro Detroit and seeing kind of like, take Belle Isle, for example, how that park system moved from city ownership and maintenance to state ownership and maintenance and then reverted back again, there will always be tension between the community that uses it and the greater good. I don't necessarily think that, decisions from Albany should direct what happens here, but there will always be a tension, and we kind of have to acknowledge that.
Yeah. So I want to talk about a little bit about this the mess that inevitably comes from big planning projects, because the way we've tended to deal with those big planning projects. And, you know, I'm going to use Battery Park, I'm going to use Brooklyn Bridge Park, I'm going to use the Hudson River Park, both of which are development and park projects. In both of those cases, they were partnerships between the city and the state in terms of leadership. And there were many people on those panels that represented many different kinds of constituencies. But I'm just curious whether or not you think that ultimately, in this case, would help or hinder the mess. And I'm going to add just one point. A very brilliant man I once worked with in San Francisco always said that before you ever have a plan or an action for any large projects, there's always chaos. And that you need that chaos. You need to go through that moment of chaos to get to the other side. So I asked that question with that in mind.
Yeah, I think you know, there could be productive chaos. I think we're seeing it happen here, and I do worry. You know, I expressed a lot of worries here today, but you know, I think the neoliberal model of city building, of like public-private partnerships, is, you know, really left us with the city that we have today, which is vastly unequal. We're about to go through the biggest wealth transfer in the history of the world, and it's going to exacerbate inequality. Our city has become a playground for rich people, and poor people are getting poorer and poorer, and we have more and more people in homeless shelters. So the neoliberal model of city development has obviously not served us. And now we have the Inflation Reduction Act. We actually have a Green New Deal. No one's calling it that, but we have, for the first time, like, billions of dollars going into public services, but we don't have a public sector that's set up to actually deliver. And I think that's really scary. Like, we need to build capacity in the public sector now to do these projects. And I think we have to be careful about, like, the models that they follow. Are they going to go back to Moses? Or are they going to really follow the mandates of Justice 40 and try to not be utilitarian? Like, I was in the Bloomberg administration. We were very utilitarian. We were like the best for the most, and also for the rich guys especially. But we need to be reparative, you know, because our society has become so imbalanced. We need to make reparations with our infrastructure investments.
I think we're ready for some questions from you all. We've got one over here.
Thank you all for being here today. The title of the symposium seems to be a value proposition, and less so about who, but why. And my question is, does the panel see a difference between decarbonized, sustainable, and regenerative? And if so, what the implications would be for your solutions or advice for us?
Somebody want to start?
I can jump in real fast. So I think Brooklyn Bridge Park is a good example of when the Port Authority started to sell the land, they were trying to sell it to the highest and best use, which was real estate. And for I wasn't around at the time, but my understanding is the community's initial reaction was against what Port Authority was trying to do. And it was not incredibly successful until they started being for the creation of a waterfront park. And it's a minor, subtle difference, but I truly believe there's a lot more political power in the visioning of where you want to go and not where you don't want to go. And so, yes, to tie in all of the pressing needs of today, including how do we decarbonize our economy, how do we solve the housing crisis, how do we build more resilient cities, how do we make them places that we want to live. The BQE, I think we need to start, instead of focusing on, I don't want a 6-lane temporary highway over Brooklyn Bridge Park, I think it will be much more politically powerful to say, where do we want to be? What do we want this land to be?
I agree with you 100%. We landed in the community land trust model in Mott Haven, precisely because of that, because we were always opposing or dealing, narratively from the negative or from the opposition, and at one point it was patently not sufficient, and internally as activists it became boring, always playing defense. And so that's when we were like, what are we gonna do about it? Like, for real, so like we're talking shit about this and about that, and we were right, rightly so. But then it's like, how do you imagine like a different model or a positive one? Because politically, in terms of the storytelling that happens and the persuasion that needs to happen, I think that dealing with a negative is like, even if you end up doing it, in this case, decarbonization, is a much harder sell than the positive narrative of what you're gonna be, like in Moses' words, the promised land. Yeah. And I very quickly, in the South Bronx, we've learned about your question, Elizabeth, before. We've learned to mistrust both the private sector, which is the people that are, annoying and harassing us right now, but we will never forget that until, say, 10 years ago, the people that screwed us over systematically were not private developers, but the city and the state. And so sometimes I caught myself, I surprised myself thinking in very, conservative ways, like, I want the city and the government out of here. And my commie friends with this faith in the city government and in the state government, the federal government, like, what are you talking about? Like, these people sponsor the burning down of our neighborhoods. And that has been the case for most of our history, particularly in the South Bronx, even in places like the Lower East Side. That was the case. So that's where community land trusts come in, because it's none of them. They don't deserve to have control, neither individually nor together, in my opinion.
Other questions from the audience? Or statements, for that matter.
What a great day, and thank you to all the speakers for putting a spotlight on our whole transportation network, not just the BQE. The 6-lane highway, unfortunately, we did have to stand up and say no. And it is about protecting our history and our neighborhoods and our residents. And sometimes you just don't have an option. And I think, in fact, Cooper Square stood up against Robert Moses decades ago to create that wonderful community land trust. What I think would help is that we have to reframe the way we do public engagement in New York City, because I think all the public engagement that seems to be meaningful is happening in sessions like this, rather than in the sessions that are organized by the city, which often we get to them and somebody has already decided what's going to happen. And so all the real public engagement seems to be happening in all these other little meetings, in community groups, and amongst the public housing residents. They're trying to figure out how to address their problems. And all of us become these volunteers. Oh, we all have to learn transportation engineering. It is a very technically complicated thing. It would be so much easier if we had a government that participated with us. All the experts that are on staff participated with us. And I think I've always thought that the public engagement process in New York City had to be better.
I'm guessing there might be some comments about that. Does anybody want to?
I agree.
I think you're right, and I think that's why but that's also why these efforts are so important, because if the government is not forthcoming in providing, what we really need and what is the right thing to do, then people need to forge those spaces themselves. And at the end, what really matters is the organizing and the energy that happens following these kind of meetings. Because even the government can provide and do the right thing, and here's the space, so Monxo can come and, like complain about stuff. What happens after that? So it's the organizing. If we, after this, we commit to really, build energy and build muscle to organize, not only us, like there are people on the ground already doing it, like in Queens, in Sunset Park, etc. And join them. And these spaces are important. Like, this is why we need this, precisely because of what you said. We need these moments. We need to create, and because these are the legitimate spaces, because the government doesn't give it to you. So you create it yourself. And there is there is nothing wrong with that. This is the people taking control over their own discussions and offering themselves the opportunity to converse. It's very simple.
I think government would be wise too to trust communities to do their own self-decision making more. Like throughout my career in government, I felt like we were afraid of communities. Like, don't go out there and to talk about what you know, because, or like I was always told, like, don't get into an unstructured conversation.
And then you came today.
Yeah. But it worked. We were always like, working on how, communities trust government. But I feel like there's a real gap in government actually trusting the expertise of communities. Like after Hurricane Sandy, we built this whole apparatus to do recovery. And all these community leaders were like, hey, we've been doing this for years. We've been, building resilience in our communities for years. And we're like, yeah, no, we're good. We got Boston Consulting Group. We're going to just do it this way. And we didn't trust them. We could have saved so much time, money, and effort if we would have trusted communities to lead.
I think the community engagement process is a universal problem, not just, to your remark about New York, I think across the United States. In multiple communities that I've worked with, except for Greece, they will come out in force for and against, and there will be a protest and a counter-protest for whatever decision you make, and I'm so excited. Democracy is very strong there. But
they've had a little more practice than the rest of us.
But there was a comment earlier about specifically changing the kind of the ethos of how does communities get involved. We should have a community engagement process that, of course, is inventive and new and fits each community individually, but we should also be changing the social perception of how we interact with these processes, so everyone comes out and gives their support or their nay vote.
No one had the chance because I forgot to put the slide on. But before coming here a few days ago, I asked my artificial intelligence overlord about like methods of solving problems, some of the most urgent problems about land ownership, et cetera, and I was surprised that the overlord replied to explore community land trust. and it replied that at the very least, we should always consider separating what is on the land and the land. And then I asked the overlord about the BQE specifically. And it came back again. I mean, this is like whatever. Like it came back again with community land trust, to explore it. I'm like, oh, well,
that's okay. You just answered the overlord, of course.
Sometimes the question you ask gets you the answer you want. Well, help me thank this incredible panel for all of your expertise and thoughts. For some reason that I don't entirely know, I was asked to make some wrap-up comments, maybe because I was the only person besides the people who needed to be here all day who agreed to come first thing in the morning and stay. So I'm going to do that very briefly, and then I'll let our incredible organizers actually close up. So I just want to add just a little personal perspective to this conversation. So I grew up 1 block away from the Bruckner Boulevard. I live 12 blocks away from the BQE in Queens. Several years ago, during Hurricane Ida, water rushed off the side of the BQE and into homes in Woodside and killed people. The crisis of the BQE is not a crisis of tomorrow or 2026. It's a crisis of now. And it's a crisis of things coming together. It's a crisis of infrastructure decisions that were made many, many decades ago. It's a crisis of communities that got broken apart. It's a crisis of climate change. And it's a crisis of our ability to envision a future that is different than the existence that we have now. That we could live in a city where we are not being poisoned by the vehicles that move us around, that we could have our communities connected together, that land could be returned to people from whom it was taken, and that we could together have more housing, more green space, better transportation corridors than we have now. It is so easy to walk around in our lives as New Yorkers and know that this is a terrible thing, but somehow put it out of our minds. This conversation about the BQE, the conversation about the Cross Bronx, the conversation that should be happening about Bruckner Boulevard, the conversation that should be happening about the FDR, are conversations about what city we want to live in the future and what we're willing to bear to have goods and services move around in an extremely old-fashioned way. I think that we collectively, just today, have proven, but it's been proved in every community conversation that's been happening over the last few years, community conversations that were organized by government, community organizations that have been organized by communities, and those of us who just have crazy ideas that we have in the middle of the night, that we could live in a cleaner, greener, safer, more affordable city if only we were visioning a future that was different. So I think what we have done today is to begin to envision that future. Not because we're really at the beginning of that exercise. We're probably 25 years into that exercise, and God forbid we get to 2053 and we're still envisioning it. But I do think that urban projects in New York City have a half-life of about 25 years. So I think we're just about right for actually making change. And to do that, as this last conversation sort of fleshed out, we need to figure out how to trust each other with our ideas about the future, to be willing to be challenged by each other in good ways and challenged by each other in hard ways, because that is the only way that we will get to the future that we all deserve. So thank you for joining me and all of the other people who've been in this room all day. I can't thank you enough for being willing to envision a better New York. Thank you.
Elizabeth, thank you so much for your generosity and your leadership. We're really grateful. Thank you. I'll make this super, super brief. Thank you so much for spending your Saturday, your rainy Saturday afternoon with us. We're super grateful for that and truly inspired by the amazing conversations that we witnessed today. We hope that we had initially thought this was the culmination of the IPA's work on the BQE project, but I was going to say that I was hoping that it would be the beginning of a sea change, but I think it's really the beginning of the chaos, and the chaos that we need to jump into in order to change the way we think about our city with regard to mobility, equity, climate, sustainability, and just the overall quality of our urban environment. So we have invited you all to join us at our blockhouse across the way here at Governor's Island. Don't worry, even though the public ferry to Manhattan ends at 6, you'll be able to return to the mainland as our guests. But we are so grateful for your participation today. We have an amazing website built by our incredible jack of all trades, Alec Ravinsky, and you'll find a resources tab there, which has links to all kinds of all things BQE. Eventually, this symposium's recording will be up on the website. And thank you all for joining us.